Hello everyone and welcome back to Uru. We are here in the Great Library of Dunny, and for this video we will be reading through all these books here. And yes, there's quite a few of them. We already read through some. As you can see, there's 3 books here that are missing. We read through those on the rooftop earlier. And yeah, this will take over an hour. Quite a bit longer than the previous one did. So, fasten your seatbelts, everyone. We've got a lot of reading to do, and hopefully have enough water. I may need to possibly recording later, because for some reason I did not actually get much water here for some reason. In any case, we're going to begin here with King Jacqueline. King Jacqueline. Jacqueline took the throne in the year 555 at the age of 80. By the time of his coronation, he had already reached the rank of guildmaster in the Guild of Stonemasons. It was Jacqueline who first publicly stated plans to rebuild the King's Arch. In 598, headed by Guildmaster Chorus of the Guild of Stonemasons, design of the arch was begun. In 600, construction started, and in 625, the arch was completed. It was a day of great celebration, and it marked their first century on earth, and because of the prophecies allowed for the passage of the great king, as a result, from the time of its completion onward, all kings sailed through the arch as part of their coronation ceremony. As construction of the arch was underway, Jacqueline planned for construction of the temple of the great king. Specifications for the building were recorded in the ancient prophecies, and Jacqueline made sure that each was followed through to the last span. Construction was finished in 643. By the way, before I continue, I recorded this after I did the next part, so if you see that flashing light across here once in a while, that's why. I decided to do this one last because it was so long, and last night when I was recording, it was way past 10 o'clock, so it would take too long, and today I worked at 8 o'clock in the morning, so I didn't want to stay up too late. Anyway, let's continue. It should be noted that at the time of construction, there were apparently quite a few people who questioned the dimensions of the building, calling them rather odd and exorbitant. However, Jacqueline would hear nothing of their complaints, and in fact managed to anger quite a few of those who worked on the temple during its construction. Once the temple was complete, Jacqueline ordered the transfer of the gold throne from the temple that Renerif had built to the new temple of the great king. In 654, Jacqueline's wife gave birth to a son. Unfortunately, the boy only lived for 10 years before dying of a rare disease. It was not 10 years after the death of the boy that Jacqueline's wife passed away, also at a young age. The tragedies seem to have had a devastating effect on Jacqueline, and in his later years he was known to be easily angered and extremely harsh. He remarried at 700, and the second wife gave birth to a son 17 years later, followed by 2 daughters. Records speak of various accusations of abuse toward his children, though nothing was ever proven. Regardless of whether or not there was abuse, it seems he was never able to get over the death of his son and first wife. As one of the prophetesses who advised him wrote in her journals, he never seemed to really love or appreciate any of them, though he did leave the throne to the oldest of them. It was Jacqueline who encouraged further private construction for the island in 775, including the Terry district. He named the high-class district after his first son, who had died ill years earlier. Jacqueline died of natural consequences in 812 at the age of 337. It was often said that Jacqueline died a very sad and unsatisfied man. The king's arch was modeled after a similar design of Gothenay. It was prophesied that the great king would be welcomed by the arch and so its construction was obviously seen as very important. Because Dunny numbers are base 25, the year 625 was very significant. Most were taken from the Relotavak of Urpal, as recorded in Guild of Stonemasons records. It is not known what the disease was. Records only indicate extremely high temperatures and extremely sore and brittle bones. Alright, one down, lots to go. King Visha. This one's pretty short. Visha took the throne in the year 812 at the age of 95. When Visha took the throne, he already had 2 sons of his own, and ended up having 3 more before his death, and a large number for Dunny. Oh well. Though his father had completely rejected religion in his later years, Visha was an extremely religious man who, some say, tried too hard to push his convictions on the people, and in the end probably pushed many away. In fact, he forced into a law a number of strict guidelines pertaining to marriage and adultery, as well as oaths and vows, many of which were removed by his son. Many say the greatest mark of Visha's reign concerned the health of his 5th son. The boy was a maintainer, and at the age of 50, on a routine check of ages, was almost killed. Though the cause of his near death is unclear, certain documents point to inhalation of toxic gases. He ended up falling into a deep coma that the healers said he would never come out of. In response, Visha gave a powerful speech, boldly announcing to the people that Yavo would heal his son and that he would awake again. Despite opposition from the church, 2 prophetesses who advised him, and the Guild of Healers, Visha maintained his faith for over 3 years until the impossible happened and his son awoke. Though many disagreed with Visha's religious convictions, there was not a single Dunny besides Visha who was not shocked by the awakening and forced to look again at their own faith in Yavo. Visha died of natural consequences in 997 at the age of 280. He left the throne to the reborn son Meroran, from the miracle written by Teshin in 1070. Alright, the next one is King Meroran. Also pretty short. King Meroran took the throne in 997 at the age of 73, exactly 20 years after emerging from his long coma. From various speeches and writings, it's obvious Meroran placed a strong value on life. Through his 162 years in power, it seems he did all he could to emphasize that same value to his people, as well as make the most of his own. It seems that a main concern of Meroran was the Dunny education system. The fact that so many of his own people were falling by the wayside apparently upset him quite a bit. So in 1124, when T. Lenar, a guildmaster of the Guild of Legislators, submitted his paper, Minor Guild's Meroran was in immediate agreement with what it said. In the paper, T. Lenar wrote, "We are creating a group of people who have no understanding of the Dunny and the strength of our blood. There is the relatively small percentage of those who learn and keep our traditions through the guilds, and a growing population of fools." Meroran, following suggestions within the paper, placed the common schools under the Guild of Legislators, and began major renovations of that system, including higher standards for instructors and longer workdays. Meroran raised the time in the common schools from 6 years, age 10 to 16, to 15 years, age 5 to 20. From there, instead of entering back into society, as had been the case, students could enter one of the new minor guilds that had been proposed by the T. Lenar and accepted by Meroran. The first of these guilds included architecture, a branch of the Guild of Stonemasons, miners and educators, and bankers, among others. While not pushing education, Meron was focused on his own life, making sure that he was living it to the fullest. Most historical documents point to addictions to hallucinogenic drinks and various drugs. As well, it seems, he carried out numerous affairs, prompting him to throw out the rules that his father had written regarding marriage and adultery. One particular record shows of affairs with prophetesses, although both the prophetesses and the religious community vehemently denied it. The public said little of Meron's shortcomings, choosing to focus more on the benefits he had brought them than the negatives. He died at the fairly early age of 235 in 1159 from natural consequences. What was expected the early death for his drinking and smoking, although many say it was somehow related to his coma years earlier. Any relationship between the king and his prophetess was extremely looked down upon, as both parties were expected to remain objective with one another and the people. Alright. Next we have King Corin. Corin took the throne in 1159 at the age of 50. Corin was the older of Meron's two sons, and the two brothers were apparently close. His younger brother was a guild captain in the Guild of Linguists, and the two remained close for much of Corin's reign. In 1159, when he took the throne, it would have been impossible to forecast the turbulent string of events that would start during his reign and not end for some years later. His grandfather had been an extremely religious man, though not everyone had agreed with his theologies. There were, in fact, a number of groups who had strongly disagreed with Visha, and though Meron had not done anything to offend them, during the reign of Corin, they were sought to make their own causes more widely known. The most dangerous of those groups was known as the Judges of Yavo. Though they had existed for some time, it was in 1303 that they began to make a name for themselves. It all seems to have begun when a writer mysteriously left the Guild of Writers in 1303. A few days later, books and ink went missing from the respective guilds. Queen ordered tightened security on the guilds, as well as a massive search for the vanished writer, but all to no avail. Unbeknownst to Corin, the judges, led by the man Eris, were writing illegal ages in an attempt to create a race they could control and force to go to war for them. In 1320, the Pinto Age was written, and the judges had what they needed. It was in 1323, with his wife about to give birth to his first son, that Corin's palace was attacked by a group of judges, along with warriors from the age of Pinto. Corin ordered his family out of the palace, as it was quickly being overtaken, and together they traveled to the other side of the city, where a special linking book was waiting for them. While traveling through the king's arch, rumors say that Corin's wife gave birth to his first son, Alcindor. Corin continued to live in the city, although his family stayed in the secret private age. The city grew more and more dangerous as the judges began to destroy more of the city and kill more of its citizens. Corin poured money into the city guard, as well as the small military of the day, although it seemed too late. In 1352, Corin was assassinated by a group of Pinto warriors being led by judges. The city was thrown into complete chaos. Known as the Regolantant Eoc judges, the sect believed they were to exercise Yavo's judgment on those who could not truly understand him as they did. Okay. Well, let's see what happens next. King Alcindor. Alcindor, the Great King. Alcindor was 29 and living on a private age with his mother when his father was killed. Instead of immediately joining the city, he remained in the private age, apparently at the suggestion of his uncle, who had come to inform Alcindor of his father's death. With a few advisors who kept him updated, Alcindor stayed in the private age trying to formulate a plan for the war that was now raging in the city. Meanwhile, his uncle, still a member of the Guild of Linguists, was translating much of the Pinto language and learning as much as he could about them. As it turned out, the judges, with the Pinto, claimed control of the Dunning government after the death of Corinne and began to move into other ages. Alcindor, after being briefed by his uncle on new information, continued to wait. A few weeks later, the waiting appeared to pay off. Reports came back that the judges had killed the leader of the Pinto for fear he was becoming more powerful and out of control. Unfortunately, the leader had not declared an heir and had left 2 sons to fight for the throne. This led to civil war within the Pinto and a complete lack of focus on the Dunny, leaving the judges empty-handed. As well, what forces there were spread out to other ages and no longer fortified in the city. The public apparently knew Alcindor was hiding, and with every passing day felt as though the prophecies were coming to fruition. Only the stone, while they pass beneath, listens to his cries and comfort his fear. Only the arch welcomes the reign of the Great One who guides us. Alcindor, they all knew, had been born directly under the arch. A new people of light, will bring great havoc to the dark. As they believed the Pinto had done, he remains hidden, while another sits in his throne, was obvious. While the public waited for him, they only grew more willing to fight for him. 15 weeks after the death of his father, Alcindor re-entered the city, for the first time in his life, with a small force. He sailed directly through the arch to the palace and reclaimed it with relative ease, while directing his soldiers and those who joined with him as they saw him enter the city. Immediately, he established safe zones and eventually informed the Pinto that he wished to begin negotiations with the Pinto warrior Makar. Alcindor agreed to help Makar defeat his brother if, in return, they would return to their home peacefully. Makar agreed if Alcindor would write him them an age to return to. The deals were signed, and in 1376, Alcindor led a force to the Pinto Age. It was there in the Battle of the Great King that Alcindor led the defeat of Makar's brother Timaeus and total victory for Dunny. Makar turned over 2 leaders of the judges, and Alcindor found the other 3 in the city. All 5 were sent to prison ages, and the books burned. Some in the society had demanded execution, but Alcindor had refused. Regardless, his coronation ceremony took place a few weeks later, and it was said not one of the Dunny did not attend the event. Our cheering was as loud as thunder, and our pride as solid as the arch through which we sailed. Throughout his reign, Alcindor wrote a good number of books of prophecies and encouraged his people to forget about their old homeland and focus on why they came to Dunny, to start again, to focus on pleasing Yavo, and to make good and right decisions. To know Yavo better should be the focus of their lives, he claimed. It was Alcindor who brought them back to the attitude they had maintained during the reign of Venerif. During his life, there were numerous rumors abounding about Alcindor and special linking abilities. Numerous witnesses claimed that he did not need linking books to go from one place to another, and numerous others claimed he could link to different spots within an age. However, none of these rumors were ever confirmed. There were apparently other rumors, much more quiet, which dealt with Alcindor and his relationship with the prophet Nehemiah. Though it seemed that Nehemiah had great respect for Alcindor, the same could not be said concerning Alcindor's opinion of Nehemiah. Apparently, the great king had little time for her, and often found her advice foolish and childish when he did consult with her. As a result, it seems Nehemiah was rarely seen with the great king and relegated to a figurehead role for ceremonies and the like. Perhaps surprisingly, Alcindor rarely consulted with any other prophets, though he did have the choice. Unbeknownst to the public who continued to praise him, Alcindor was working with the guilds of writers and healers on a plague. It was said that it could be used as a biological weapon in case such action was ever needed in the future. As far as the Pinto, the link between their age and Dunny was still open, as Alcindor insisted on the continuation of resources from the Pinto, although it appears that some of his associates advised against it. It was in 1466 that Mikar came to the palace, through other books given to him by judges, and killed Alcindor's wife and 2 sons. Alcindor himself killed Mikar in what records describe as an astounding battle. 2 days later, Alcindor ordered the release of the plague to the new Pinto age. Apparently, his counselors advised against it, but he demanded his orders to be carried out. The plague was released, though records don't specify how, and the entire population of Pinto died 3 days later. Unfortunately, it seems as though most of them realized what was happening and did not die before linking to a number of other ages and infecting numerous other cultures. The sickness did not affect Dunny, although the Guild of Chemists began to fear that it could mutate to something that would. Once the public became aware of the plague, they obviously blamed the Pinto for the devastation, as they had no knowledge of the Alcindor's participation in the plague. All of the books to which the Pinto had access were gathered together to be forever destroyed. Then in 1500, Alcindor gathered his people together to inform them of the truth. It was in that speech that he told them he had created the plague and then ordered its release. At the end of the speech, he asked to be sealed into the temple of the great king, as built by Jocrine, with any infected books, as well as any books that linked the Dunny to the past, as he had preached they must completely forget. A year later, Alcindor was sealed within the temple, and it was then that the dimensions and shape of the buildings made sense, as it was required to hold massive amounts of books. Solath, Alcindor's chosen heir, took temporary charge of Dunny, while the public waited for the great king's return. However, after 6 months had passed, records state that Solath uncovered the final wishes of Alcindor and read them publicly. Alcindor, he read, was not to return, and, for no reason, should the seal on the temple of the great king ever be broken. In addition, the note stated that Solath was to be officially designated as permanent king. So convincing was Solath's shock upon reading the note, it was said that the thought of the note being a hoax was never considered. Numerous personal journals and government transcripts state the public's disbelief at the statements. Solath himself said, "For how could he leave us in such a state?" Though there were many calls to break the seal of the temple, a direct command of the great king was foolish. As well, the books within the seal were infected books, and should not be opened for good reasons. So in 1502, the temple of the great king was renamed the Tomb of the Great King, upon orders of Solath, and he was assumed dead. However, most still believed he would return. The 2 brothers were both fighting for the control of the Pinto, and Makar felt most strongly his people no longer owed the judges anything. His brother Timayu felt the opposite. From the Great King, written by Leshna in 1399. Nemiya's Legacy, written by Timin in 1609. Though not done often, it was possible for a king to leave the throne to his successor if he was wished to be gone for an extended period of time. No records point to the note being anything but the true wishes of the great king. But it is interesting to note that it was never even thought of as a fabricated note. As spoken by Grandmaster Nemes of the Guild of Healers to the Council. Okay. And that is that one. We're making progress here. King Solath. Okay, pretty short one. Solath took the throne in 1502 at the age of 79. It should be noted that at his coronation ceremony, Solath was given a newly designated crown. Alcindor had retained his own, and it was common opinion among the Dunni that such a crown should not be worn again. It should also be stated that Solath's father had been the great Grand Master of the Guild of Writers and had helped Alcindor create the book that was responsible for the plague. Why Alcindor chose Solath in particular, he never stated. Regardless, Solath inherited a fairly stable culture, although one that was on the fringe of religious anarchy. The greatest leader of the time had left them, and they were a lost people without him to guide them. There were going to be repercussions, although it is doubtful anyone had sensed that they would occur so quickly, most of all Solath. It was in 1520 that the prophet Nehemiah, who had been the great king's own advisor, wrote the Book of Nehemiah and sent the culture into religious upheaval. The book denounced the words of the great king, calling him a fraud and an impostor, and gave logical arguments to each of his writings. He killed thousands, betrayed us, and left us with no one to guide us. Why do we believe his words and expect him to still return? The book stated. At first there was outrage at the writings, and Nehemiah was declared a fool and heathen, most loudly by King Solath, who also apparently took offense to the writing. In 1527, Nehemiah vanished, some said killed by an angry mob, and others said taken away by angels. Regardless, by 1550 there was growing sentiment that Nehemiah's book carried some truth. There was a growing tide of disharmony within the people, and there was nothing Solath could do to stem it. Those who had always thought the great king would return were beginning to understand that he would not, and they were beginning to grow angrier at the way he had left them. Suddenly, there were numerous reasons to believe that Nehemiah's writings may have carried some truth. Perhaps we have all been betrayed by this man who we once called great, wrote one anonymous writer. Looking back, credit should be given to Solath for keeping his people as unified as he did. In 1604, he announced his plans to create Kerem, a civic district including an opera house and concert hall. The distraction away from the religious arguments was obvious to the public, but they seemed to welcome it. There was excitement from his proposal, and construction began in 1610. The entire area was not finished until 1650 due to varying construction problems. But when it finally did open, there was a great excitement within the culture. Solath's wife passed away in 1735, leaving him with two daughters. It was not long after her passing away that he remarried, against the advice of a prophetess, to a younger woman named Jolatha. Jolatha gave birth to Solath's first son in 1748, and though Solath was extremely pleased, many in the religious community were somewhat apprehensive. Public records clearly indicate that Jolatha was a well-known member of an influential cult group known as the Tree, although Solath denied that fact to the day of his death. The culture remained fairly stable until the death of Solath in 1779. He was 356 years old and left the throne to his firstborn son. Alrighty. King Maruta. Maruta took the throne in 1779 at the young age of 31. There were multiple leaders, many of them from the church, who publicly feared that the appointment of Maruta would cause great damage to the already fragile religious culture. The fears appear to have been justified, as Maruta's reign was a turbulent one. In fact, it was often stated that it was his mother, Jolatha, who ruled the throne for most of Merita's 236 years in power. Merita himself had no time to rule Dani. He was much too busy, too focused on satisfying the women who ruled him. In 1817, Merita proposed construction of the Temple of the Tree, marking the first time any king officially supported anything other than the original beliefs of Renerif. Just as important, Merita suggested that the line of the Great Zero, which had been chosen by Renerif, was inaccurate. However, he did not officially change the line. He most likely realized such a change would have carried far too many implications upon the society concerning construction, navigation, etc. His goals, or Jolatha's, in such a remark were simply to question the beliefs of Renerif and encourage the cults to build in a newer section of the city. His remarks were all that were needed. The temple was built, with strong opposition from some, in 1843. A few years later, Merita sanctioned the construction of the Temple of Water and the Temple of the Sacred Stone. Both were finished in 1876 and 1902 respectively. All were built on Merita's recommended line of the Great Zero. As the years passed, cults sprang up everywhere, wreaking havoc on the religious beliefs the Dani had once had. The temple of Yavo was empty, and its priests and prophets were small in number, as many had left to pursue other beliefs. In 1975, Merita attempted to change the rules and restrictions of the Writers' Guild, including altering their oath. He claimed his proposals would leave them more flexible in their writing and allow the Dani to do more. However, the proposal was met with staunch resistance from Grand Master Tremmel, who adamantly opposed the king, and, as the records show, refused to change the oath of the Ailish had written. As it turns out, the refusal cost Tremmel his life, many say on order from Jolatha. Years later, many viewed Tremmel's refusal as one of the most heroic deeds of Dani history. If those rules and oaths had changed, many believed, as Tremmel had, the path to tyranny would not have been long behind. And that is why we exist, wrote Tremmel. Once Tremmel was found dead, the Writers' Guild, as a whole, refused to change the proposed changes, and in the oath and regulations in support of their fallen comrade. Eventually, Jolatha, through Merita, gave up trying. By far, Jolatha's most destructive action came the year of her death. In 1999, she convinced her son to break the seal of the tomb of the great king. Why she wished for such an action is not clear, although numerous possibilities were proposed years later. Though few in number, there were still some who believed the great king would return, and Jolatha was infuriated at any power the great king had. She possibly wanted to prove once and for all that he was dead, an impostor, and fool. Others wrote that she was interested in gaining access to some of the ancient books, as the she believed they held special power. Still others said she was simply mad, while others claimed she was possessed and an agent of Chukuth. Regardless, the seal was broken. The act was carried out in secret, in the dead of night, and as even those who opposed the great king would have found such an action blasphemous and dangerous. A number of books were taken from the tomb and placed in the temple of the tree, along with what Jolatha claimed was a piece of robe from the body of the dead king. Jolatha died 2 days later from an unknown illness, while the books she had taken out remained in the temple of the tree. Merita quietly ordered the tomb sealed again, and much stronger. It was said that Merita believed his mother had been cursed for entering the grave, and he himself was petrified of it, or many mention of the great king in the later years of his life. Merita, known as an unfaithful man, died 15 years later with one of his lovers. Guild of Healers records indicated massive poisoning as the cause of his death. He was 267. His murderer was never discovered, although there were numerous suspects. Though he had many enemies, most agreed it was either his wife, for obvious reasons, or son, who despised his father's weaknesses and lack of judgment. Ironically, it was that son, his oldest, whom he left the throne to. From the journals of the prophetess Elisha, precedent existed for such a claim. On previous ages, the line of the Great Zero could either point from the Great Zero itself toward magnetic north, as Minerva had chosen, or toward another prominent landmark, as Merita suggested it should have been. Grandmaster Themis of the Guild of Writers in a speech to the Five Lords in 7032. Truth was the equivalent of the devil in the Denny religion. Okay, that's what I figured. Truth right here. Okay. Next one. King Gan. Gan took the throne in 2015 at the age of 144. Though he was not necessarily convinced of the greatness of the great king of Oyavo, for that matter, Gan was far from the despot his father was. Unfortunately, he was never quite given the chance to do much for his people, as the sins of his grandmother consumed his reign in the throne. 6 months after Gan's coronation, the first signs of the plague began to show themselves. Eventually, the healers would discover that the plague was an evolved version of the disease that Alcindor had created to destroy the Pento. The evolved version cut dunny lifespans in half and caused massive infertility. For the elderly and the young, death usually came quickly in the form of heart failure. The appearance of the plague and the eventual announcement that it was similar to what the great king had created caused the public to cast most of the blame for the illness on the great king. Very few people knew of Jolath's request to open the tomb. Those who knew of the breaking of the seal seemed to have not spoken of it, or possibly were not heard if they did. Numerous records indicate that as far as the public was concerned, the plague was the great king's fault. Somewhat surprisingly, because of the infertility rates, Gan managed to have a son in 2050. He died 20 years later at the age of 199, after being in the throne for only 55 years, the shortest of any king. Gan left a son a population that was slowly dying, both physically and emotionally, and there was no cure in sight. The plague ended up killing over a quarter of the Dunning population and cutting birth rates in half until its cure was found in 2262. Is that a 2? I can't tell what the number is. I mean, if that's a 2, then it looks different than this number, which is obviously a 2. These two here. Interesting. Alrighty, next up we have King Benasharin. Benasharin took the throne in 2070 at the age of 20, a record that was never surpassed. He was extremely young to inherit the throne, and his short reign displayed his immaturity. It was said that there were never any control of leadership from the throne while Benasharin sat in it. As a result, the people were forced to look elsewhere for some kind of trust or hope. Most turned to religion, leading to many more factions and cults. Many claimed healing powers, either from nature, special leaders, or Yahweh himself, through a variety of different means. It seems clear that Benasharin wavered in his stance on just about everything, including religion. In some speeches, he begged Yavo for the healing, while in others he sought for help from the tree. In the meantime, he was of no help to the healers or chemists, both of which were working hard to find a cure. In fact, some of Ben-Ashemin's speeches point to public condemnation of the guilds, accusing them of shallow efforts and failing their own people. Those who held faith that any cure existed outside of miracles and or special portions were few and far between. The population continued to die, and the amount of children born decreased tremendously. Ben-Ashem himself died in 2193 at the young age of 143, without any descendants to leave the throne to. In fact, so few children were being born that Ben-Ashem had trouble choosing an heir, even from his own staff. As a result, he chose his 179-year-old uncle to take the throne after his death. It was later said that some higher power must have been involved in such a choice, as Ben-Ashem was far too ignorant to choose an heir that made so much sense. It was often customary to choose the child of a staff member if a king did not wish to choose or could not any of his own blood. Taken from the writings of Grandmaster Isham of the Guild of Legislators. Alright, next one. King Hemelin. Okay, whoops, nope, not quite done yet. Hemelin took the throne in 2193 at the age of 179. Hemelin had been a guildmaster in the Guild of Healers, and it was said he took the throne with rage in his heart and fire in his mouth. He was extremely angered over public opinion of his guild and made his mission to make sure that a cure was found. Some say he exhibited more power and authority in the throne in 1 week than his nephew had in 123 years. Hemelin was fairly convinced that a cure lay in the books of old, and he had been encouraging the healers to look there, long before his coronation as king. However, his nephew had been hesitant to allow access to the books, something that immediately changed once Hemelin had authority to look through them. Hemelin seemed to be a fairly devout follower of Yavo, and often claimed that only Yavo would heal them, not the other gods that his people were seeking. In 2255, Hemelin became extremely ill, and most thought was about to die. The Guild of Healers continued to try and prevent death, but the prognosis was very grave. It was during his days in the sickbed that he met a woman named Leyland. She helped to care for him, and as time passed, Hemelin found himself living just to see her one more time, as he wrote later. Leyland must have felt the same way. The new love seemed to forge a new will to live. Hemelin recovered, and to the day he died, praised Leyland for the reason he was able to defeat the plague. 2 years later, Leyland helped the rest of Dunny defeat the plague. Rumors say that while searching through the old histories that her relationship afforded her access to, she found him hints as to where most of the old books had been kept. It was a few months later that the Book of Breveni, a particular book that Hemelin had always sought, was found. 6 years after the discovery, the Guild of Healers, led by Guildmaster Jason, considered the plague cured. Records point to a tremendous celebration, like had never been seen before. A newfound optimism spread throughout the culture, and unofficially, the Denny Renaissance began. It should also be noted that on this day in 2262, King Hemelin and Leyland wed in a grand ceremony. In 2270, the first post-plague child was born, and Hemelin promised to give him the throne as a symbolic gesture of hope and celebration. Though Hemelin tried to use the end of the plague as a tool to encourage his people back to Yavo, it did not seem to succeed. Instead, there seemed to be a newfound love of the culture itself, of the arts, of technology, and a further exploration into the truths of the universe. In 2350, the Minor Guild of Miners, following the encouragement of Hamelin, announced their plans for drastic improvement in mining methods and technologies. Hamelin left an unbeat but rather dazed culture to his successor when he passed away at the age of 342 in 2356. From the Healing of Dunny, written by Manesha in 2294. Though others had lived through the illness, healers' records indicate a 95% fatality rate once the disease reached its later stages. A drink was developed that prevented the body from contracting the illness even when directly exposed. From the Healing of Dunny, written by Manessa in 2294. As a result, the day became a day often chosen for marriage in later years. Taken from the journal of King Hamelin, written directly before his death in 2356. Alright. Well, the next book here, as you can see, is missing, which was that of King Negan, which we already read in that rooftop earlier. Next up, we have King Henash. Henash took the throne in 2533 at the age of 66. Henash's first major accomplishment was the ordering of the construction of the new Guild of Miners facility. The construction marked the first use of extrusion in construction and work, begun in 2577 and finished in 2580. Marked a much faster and more efficient means of building. Henash had been a member of the Guild of Stonemasons before his coronation. As such, records point to him being extremely interested in the mining and construction technologies that were being pursued. As well, Henash was one of the strongest proponents for expansion within the cave system. Though Henash's push for expansion was not met with much enthusiasm at the time, it set the foundation for great expansion that would occur under the reign of his son Nidra, with the sculptor Lakir leading the charge. Henash was apparently also very interested in pursuing better relationships with other cultures, often pushing for further interaction and increasing trade. He not only opened up the rules on trade, but also pushed the cultural rules concerning relationships with those of non-Dunny blood. In 2709, 5 years after the death of his first wife, who died giving birth to his fourth son, Henash married a woman of non-Dunny blood. The fact that the marriage was met with little opposition was a sign in itself of the relaxing attitude of the people toward the outsiders. The effect of such actions upon the culture was grand. Foreign materials were used much more in construction, as well as clothing and jewelry, and foreign music and art influence began to show itself in the Dunny art of the day. It was apparently with some thankfulness that Henash's second wife did not bear him a son. Though the culture had relaxed, it is rather clear that the public did not want to even have to deal with the possibility of non-Dunny blood in the throne. In fact, one author went so far as to say, even had they bore a child, it would have made for a very uneasy public to have such a being living with the palace, perhaps taking the public's acceptance too far. Henash died in 2779 at the age of 312, leaving his fourth son to rule. There had been strict regulations up to that point concerning imported goods and travel between ages. Up to that point, no one, most of all a king, dared to marry an outsider. From How They Came, a detailed look at what started the Medis War by Jamin, written in 7201. Okay. You may have noticed some cuts I did earlier. That's because my game crashed in the middle of me reading. So I lost my place where I had been reading. I had to close the game and reopen it. And I completely lost track of where I had been reading from. So I may have repeated some parts of it, but if I did, that part was edited out. Just you're aware. So let's continue with King Nidra. Nidra took the throne in 2779 at the age of 75. Nidra had been a member of the minor guild of sculptors at the same time as the great sculptor Lakir, and as a result, the two were excellent friends. As Nidra took the throne, Lakir, who was 4 years younger, was starting to be recognized. Those who had seen his work were already claiming him as one of the greatest artists that he had ever seen, even though most had never heard of his name. Nidra had always been a proud supporter of cave expansion, and once he gained the throne, made it his mission to make sure that his people felt the same way. Nidra's 3 older brothers were very close to him, and in fact took the role of his closest advisors. Each was a guildmaster, the oldest with the Guild of Miners, the second with the Guild of Stonemasons, and the third with the Minor Guild of Architects. Because of their positions, each ended up having a great effect on the accomplishments of Nidra. Most of the evidence supports the fact that it was not Nidra's persuasive speeches or motivational abilities alone that pushed the expansions, but also the fantastic skill and talent of Lakir. He only needed one chance to prove his skill to the public, and Nidra gave him that opportunity in 2807 with the design from monument to the discovery of the Book of Bireni. After that, Lakir, along with Nidra and his brother, presented a plan for a new residential district. From that point forward, it seems as though expansion could not have been stopped even if someone had tried. Throughout the 221 years of Nidra's reign, 4 new districts were begun, including the residential Jaren, the elite of the elite districts Kale, the business district of Kali, and the industrial district managing importation and manufacturing of foreign goods, Nuraville district. In 2916, the Guild of Mechanists announced industrial extrusion, allowing for further improvements in construction methods, including unistructural buildings. Nidra passed away in the year 3000 at the age of 296. He had 2 daughters, but no sons of his own to give the throne. Instead, he chose the oldest son of his brother to succeed. For the Man from Dictiri by Kemal, written in 3243. Instead of the joining of blocks that had been used up to that point, unistructural construction allowed for the weaving of different stone, almost like a sweater, as one historian described it, making it appear as a single seamless piece of stone. Alright. Ooh, we have a door here. That means we're roughly halfway there. At least as far as the number of spots go. Probably not the books, but we're very close there anyway. Before I begin, I'm going to give you a drink of water here. King Vakiri. Vakiri took the throne in 3000 at the age of 81. In the same year of Vakiri's coronation ceremony, a man by the name of Tivar was born. Beginning in 3077, many say he defined Vakiri's reign more than Vakiri himself. Tivar was an ardent follower of the great king and spent his entire growing up studying the king's teachings and words. By the time he was 65, he was apparently appalled at the state of his people. especially pertaining to religious matters. Though he began on a small scale, in a matter of years, Tafar became one of the most influential men in Denny history. He was a powerful leader, a gifted speaker, and a tremendous motivator, and by 3077, a well-known name. It was 3077 that Tafar publicly denounced the sects of his peoples, including the government's, lack of faith in the principles and laws of Yavo that they were founded upon. He often pointed to the council chamber and other government structures that now covered the tomb of the great king as a symbol of what the hearts and souls of Denny had become. There was no longer a time for religion, as government and power have stolen our love, he stated numerous times. Most of the public seemed to agree with Tafar, especially concerning the tomb of the great king and its covering. They believed that they should never have allowed it to happen. They believed they should never have allowed it to happen. Although not remembered as a great event in itself, most historians agreed that credit should have been given to Rakiri's reaction to the teachings of Tafar. Rakiri at first was infuriated at Tafar's speeches and his apparent disapproval of the culture. In return, he denounced Tafar and his teachings, and even threatened to have him imprisoned. In 3081, Rakiri supposedly attended one of Tafar's speeches in an effort to ridicule it and give the other side to the public. Instead, he ended up in a public debate with Tafar. According to witnesses, it was a debate that Tafar clearly won. Though Tafar handled the debate with the king as best he could, at times his words were rather harsh, words to which the king had no response, and ended up bringing quite a bit of ridicule upon himself instead of Tafar. However, instead of ordering Tafar's death, which he probably could have done, he returned to his palace and thought about what he had heard. 5 days later, Rakiri personally invited Tafar to the palace, and later that same day announced that he had chosen Tafar as his main prophet, and asked forgiveness from his people for the wrongs, not only of himself, but of the kings before him. Those who personally witnessed the speech of King Rakiri left the event transformed. It was not long until their personal transformations began to change the entire culture. It was not long until the personal... By 3100, 600 years after the government records showed 2,500 registered sects, there were 47 sects in existence. Only 10 of those sects' membership was greater than 500. The public seemed to return again to the beliefs of the culture had been founded upon, those that Venirif had taught, and the great king had expanded upon. The people were again unified, and much work was done to join the classes of rich and poor that by that time had already begun to separate. There was major renovation of deteriorating districts, mostly poor, and construction of a new theater, company, and concert hall in the Bellori district, would have been one of the poorer districts in the entire city. In 3112, Rakiri announced, with Tafar by his side, plans for grand renovations and almost complete reconstruction of the Great Temple. Rakiri also announced that the old line of the Great Zero was accurate and should be honored again. The temple itself was to take advantage of handheld extruder technology that had been developed in 3092. As well, the great artist Fali was to paint the inside of the temple. As it turned out, it was Fali's final masterpiece as he passed away in 3123, 6 months after the completion of the temple. For the remaining years of Rakiri's reign, expansion continued both outside and inside the cavern. New mining technology was seemingly announced annually, bringing with it great prestige to the relatively newly formed major guild of miners. Tavar passed away at the young age of 218 in 3218. Vakiri was so greatly disturbed at his passing that he ordered 5 days of national sadness. There were minor protests from a few of the still remaining sects who obviously did not follow the order, but for the most part, Denny mourned with Vakiri over the loss of the prophet. Vakiri died a year after Tavar at the age of 300, leaving the throne to his firstborn son, Djara. From Yavo's voice, written by Adesh in 3143, many witnesses' testimonies of the event are chronicled in Yavo's voice. According to the prophetess Shammah, Vakiri was greatly affected by the words. He refused to speak to anyone for 2 days following the debate. Though women usually took the roles of prophets, the choice of Tavar was the one that no one argued. Shammah herself was said to be thrilled that Tavar's wisdom was being sought. From Yavo's voice, written by Adesh in 3143. Considered by most to be the greatest artist of the Dunni Renaissance. Alright. We are making good progress here. I think there's like 17 spots, so not 17 books. 1, 2, 3. I think there's 4 missing spots there. I'll come back here in a moment. Let me make sure of that. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. There's 4 spots there, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 books left. So we are making really good progress here. King Djara. Djara took the throne in 3219 at the age of 114. Though his father was considered to be an extremely decent and honorable man, especially in his later years, Djara did not follow in those footsteps. It said that he was an intelligent man, but that he used that intelligence and cleverness for his own personal gain throughout his life. In fact, rumors say that Djara succeeded rather well at convincing his own father that he was the perfect choice for the throne, when most believed that the one of his 2 younger brothers would have done much more for his people than he ever did. If there was one thing that seemed to direct Djara's reign, it was personal gain. He was known as a masterful pretender long after his death, while those who saw through his lies during his reign were few and far between. Due to Djara's nature, there is not much good that can be said about his time in the throne. The palace underwent a major renovation in 3271, and in 3279 the Writers' Guild presented Djara with the king's age, one of the most beautiful and amazing ages that had been written up to that point. It was later discovered that Djara had ordered the age written by 2 writers who eventually died of mysterious illnesses after their work was done. Djara was married officially to 1 woman, although there were many rumors of multiple other companions. As it turned out, Djara was also known within his inner circle to be an extremely jealous man, especially of his wife and the other women in his life. In 3285, Djara's oldest brother was imprisoned for the creation of illicit ages, a crime he vehemently denied to the time of his imprisonment. Djara expressed great sorrow at the sentencing, although it was later learned, well after Djara's death, that the crime had been set up as punishment for what Djara had perceived as lustful looks from his brother. In 3298, a guildmaster of the Guild of Masters of Miners was killed in a freak accident while inspecting the progress of new tunnels. Again, it was later learned that Djara had ordered the man killed due to a relationship he had many years earlier with one of Tajar's lovers, long before Tajar had met her. Though Tajar's reign was viewed as fairly repulsive by most, it is important to note that for the first time in their history, the people of Duni remained strong and focused, even under the leadership of a poor king. The words and teachings of Tavar stayed in their hearts, and they focused on their personal lives. And if they were pleasing to Yavo more than their king. If there is anything good to be said of Tajar, it is that he did not destroy the fragile condition of his people. Religion was not important to him, and thus, though he never did anything to encourage his people one way or another, he did nothing to prevent those who wished to believe a certain way from doing so. Tajar died in 3422 at the age of 317 and left the throne to his third son. Though Tajar claimed that the boy was born of his wife, there were quite a few rumors that the boy was actually the first son of one of Tavar's younger maidens. The rumor was never proved either way, as both his wife and the maiden passed away 2 years after the boy was born. Though officially Tajar had 3 sons. Though officially Tajar had 3 sons, it is possible that he actually fathered 12 sons and 7 daughters, an exorbitant number for Duni. Excerpted from the Grandmaster's Germans of the Guild of Writers, Private Journal. From The Lost Son, written by the prophetess Helesi in 3422. Grandmaster Germon's Private Journal. Master Germon's Private Journal. From The Lasting Impact, written by the grandson of Tavar, Elam, in 3576. It should be noted that most of these facts were not public information until long after Tajar's death. For the most part, the Duni honestly believed that Tajar had been a decent king, though some began to judge the reign of Tajar by his son. It was not until much later, when truths were revealed, that the public's opinion of Tavar truly changed. Alright. What do we have here next? King Tiamel. Tiamel took the throne in 3422 at the young age of 39. Like his father, Tiamel's major concern was personal pleasure. Unlike his father, he seemed to be not only nearly as clever at hiding his true intentions from his people. He seemed to be not nearly as clever. Okay. In spite of Tiamel's inability to lead, a few worthwhile historical events were carried out during his reign. First was the construction of Stone Eater in 3469. Though Tiamel really had nothing to do with the Guild of Miners' first colossal tunneling machine, he claimed quite a bit of the credit at its christening. Grandmaster Naaman of the Guild of Miners, who did spearhead the effort, was irate with the lack of mention of his own name during the speech and made his thoughts public in the days that followed. Like his father, Tiamel carried out relations with quite a few different women, besides his wife, Shema, whom he married in 3477. Unlike his father, it was said of Tiamel that these women, including his wife, much more easily persuaded him. Public opinion clearly believed that Shema was a rather incredible woman. Why she stayed with him through his entire life, even through his well-publicized affairs, was not as clear. Some said she used Tiamel and the marriage for her benefit, as she definitely had his ear. Others said it was because she was a faithful follower of Yahweh, and believed that the promise she had made to him was not meant to be broken. Regardless, it seems clear that Shema was an intelligent woman who, though it was never stated publicly, for all practical purposes, held the throne from 3477 on. In 3500, women became eligible for minor guild education, though there had been women participation in the minor guilds before that point, actresses, etc. They had never been officially recognized as members of those guilds. Though there was a push to allow women to join the major guilds as well as the minor, Shammah herself gave a strong case not to allow such an event to happen in 3523. She strongly disagreed with women being in governmental positions, a seemingly ironic view, as she was basically king of Dunny at the time of her speech. Regardless, she argued that women had much more important duties, including the guiding of children. The push for such allowances seemed to fade away in the years following her speech. In 3574, Shammah gave birth to Tiamel's first son, at least that the public knew of. For the remaining years of Tiamel's reign, Shema focused on the raising of her son, whom she vowed would not be the same kind of man as his father. A daughter was born 30 years later, and Shema raised her with equal resolve. Again, though the people were not led well, they remained strong in their beliefs and purposes, somewhat ignoring the bad leadership of Tiamel and instead focusing on the high example of his wife. Tiamel passed away from an unknown disease in 3654 at the age of 271, giving the throne to his firstborn son. Written by the prophetess Athsheba in private journals. From Shammah, written by Leyland in 3890. Shammah's words were spoken to the council as they debated whether or not to allow women into the major guilds. From the lasting impact written by the grandson of Tavar, Elmin, in 3576. Okay, what's next here? King Kedri. Pretty short one here. Kedri took the throne in 3654 at the age of 80. Kedri himself was seen by many as a testament to the type of woman his mother had been. The day of Kedri's coronation was the proudest moment of Shammah's life. She often said, up until the day she passed away in 3689. Whether or not they agreed with Kedri's decisions, it seems most did, there was seemingly hardly a single Dunny who did not greatly respect and care for Kedri. He was a king for the people, and most historians agree, was the most popular king of Dunny history, besides the Great King. Kedri led a number of small proposals that often benefited the lower classes. At the same time, it seems, he assured the higher classes that the proposals were the right thing to do. Up to that point, the island had basically been set aside for the elite. It was Kedri who established the district of Shamathin, later changed to Karathin, as a more affordable residential district. Kedri also donated his own Age of the Kings, written during the reign of his grandfather, to the common library. He directed money to massive renovation projects throughout Dunny, including further additions to the Great Temple, the Opera House, and further renovations to Baleri, the deteriorating district that Rakeri had started years earlier. In the numerous books and journals written about Kedri, it is said that he often walked the streets of Dunny and attended events with the rest of his people, as though he were one of them. He was married in 3686 at a public ceremony that was open to all who wished to attend. As one writer said of the event, if you did not want to be there, you do not want to be Dunny. Kedri eventually passed away in 3903 at the age of 329, leaving the throne to his firstborn son. Alright. Let's see here. I think we have 10 left. King Lemeshal. Lemeshal took the throne in 3903 at the age of 100. Lemeshal had been fairly involved in the minor guild of actors, although it was said that what especially interested Lemeshal was illusion. Up to that point, there had been a few different magic clubs, although nothing official. So in 3961, Lemeshal, with quite a bit of trouble, forced the establishment of the minor guild of illusionists. It was not a guild that most found necessary, but Lemeshal argued that neither was the guild of actors, painters, or musicians. Used entertainment, of which illusion was a valid form. Ironically, it was later discovered that the establishment of the guild was an illusion in itself. While the guild was debated, Lemeshal established an undercover intelligence force to keep track on the more dangerous factions and subgroups of Dunny. They were a highly secretive group of which the public had little or no knowledge until years later. And so, with the confirmation of the Guild of Illusions, the Relima, literally translated the unseen, were also established. Though the previous few kings had been fairly focused on Dunny and expanding their own culture and territory, Lemeshal again looked toward the outside cultures in a manner that had not been seen since Henash. In 3975, he remarried as his first wife had passed away at a young age, to an outsider. Unlike Henash, who had also married an outsider, Lemeshal and his new wife bore a son, his first, 20 years later, in 3995, and another son in 1414. For the first time, the Dunny were truly confronted with their views on outside cultures, and the arguments were said to have started as soon as Lemeshal's son was born, as to whether or not he would be allowed to someday rule as king. Unfortunately, though Lemeshal had led quite a few efforts to supply better lives for other cultures, along with freer trade and sharing of resources with other ages, the remaining years of his reign were dominated by whether or not his son would be allowed to reign. To Lemeshal's credit, though he could not have forced his will concerning his son upon his people, he never did. If his son were to eventually reign, he said, he will only be over people who want him to. In 4030, the council decided that a king had to be of pure Dunny blood. Lemeshal signed the decision into law the following year. When he died in 4083, he left the throne to the youngest child of his cousin, whose mother had been the younger sister of his father, Kedri. Taken from his speech to the council arguing for the establishment of the guild, Lemeshal did not need council approval to establish the guild. Though many kings preferred council approval, it was said later that Lemeshal purposely wanted the debates to take place as a distraction. Okay. I want to take a look at this one again real quick for a moment. Okay. While I was reading this journal, I thought for a brief moment I actually skipped a journal. But thankfully I did not. Okay. We just read this one. Lemeshal. And this one is King Ishak. Alright. Ishak took the throne in 4083 at the age of 85. His grandmother had been Shama, and of Ishak it was often said that he ran his throne almost exactly as his uncle Kedri had. He was another of the people's kings and refused to separate himself from his people or view himself at a higher level than those he served. It seems a king with such an attitude was hard to not like, and his popularity was close to that of Kedries. Like Lemachel, he focused on the involvement of non-Dunni and their importance to the Dunni culture and expansion. His powerful words of equality between the Dunni and non-Dunni were truly put to the test in 4103. Ishak and his wife had been touring a food facility run by natives and on the age of Yamas. As it turns out, the party was ambushed, and Ishak's wife was taken by a group of natives who managed, using Dunni linking books, to easily escape before Ishak's or his guards could react. As word leaked out of the event, the words animals, uncivilized, and primitive were used to describe those of the other worlds in a way that had not been used since the Pinto War. Ishak fought for the people's new perception, and argued that not all outside cultures should be judged on a few radicals. His words, however, were seen as empty by much of the public as he waited for word on his wife. Word finally came. The Yamas wanted their own worlds to rule, as they felt the Dunni ruled them. They had specific demands for the kind of worlds, many of which were impossible, as they had no concept of the art of writing. Unless they were given the 3 worlds they demanded, Ishak's wife would be executed. Wait a minute. Okay. Many viewed Ishak as a faithful study of history, and in particular, the Pinto War. Because of his knowledge of history and his belief in the integrity of the Yamas, he was fairly convinced that it was not the Yamas who wanted the books, but some small faction of Dunni who was directing them. Rumors say that he was even fairly convinced of the particular faction that was doing it. As was the case with the Pinto War, it had not been the Pinto who were to blame, but the judges who had wrongly sought power. Given Ishak's apparent distrust of some within his own people more than those were not Dunni, he had been a strong supporter of the Reliyama. As it turns out, it was their information that saved him. There were a number of groups who felt as though Dunni should be completely sealed from the other cultures. One in particular had been especially vocal in their opinions, especially while Ishak's wife had been held captive, using the tragedy to further their own cause. It was to this group Ishak apparently directed the Reliyama, ordering them to uncover any information they could. 3 days later, Ishak sent out word that he had no intention of giving the Yamas the worlds they had asked for. Hours later, Reliyama informants followed 2 members of the faction Ishak had suspected, to an illegal age where his wife was imprisoned. Once the public received word that had once again been their own people directing the operation, records indicate that they were really dismayed. Plans were uncovered that indicated the faction was to kill his wife no matter whether the ages were given or not, to only prove further that outsiders could not be trusted. In fact, it seems as though the public was quickly learning that it was their own blood who could not be trusted. As Renerif and the Greek king had often said, it was a great power they had been entrusted with, and it was in his own hearts that must be watched, a temptation too great to be resisted without strict rules or willing hearts. As a result, there was a great push for more strict guidelines for interaction with other ages as well as rules for the ages themselves. They sought the rules not because the other cultures were saved, but because our own culture could not be trusted to deal with them honorably. Ashak passed away in 4291 at the age of 293, leaving the debates to his firstborn son. Taken from city guard records, taken from transcripts of Grandmaster Jakins. Is it Jakins or Jakinus? There's always an apostrophe there for some reason. Of the Guild of Writers, speech to Ishak. Depending on sources, two different groups are credited with the kidnapping, although Reliama records indicate that it was a group known as Blood of Yavel. Other records indicate it was a group known as Light of Dunny. Taken from the Book 1 of the Great King, From How They Came, a detailed look at what sorted the Medis War by Jamin, written in 7201. Alrighty. Let's see here. I believe we have just 8 left. King Lasheminesh. That's a mouthful. Lasheminesh took the throne in 4291 at the age of 123. Though Lasheminesh's reign was relatively short, it is believed he made the most of the years he was given. Lasheminesh had seen firsthand the effects of too much interaction with other cultures, and because of that held firmly to his views, disagreeing with what was becoming the majority of view in Dunny. He often pointed out, as his father had also had, that before the Pinto War, strict regulations had existed on interaction with other cultures, and it did nothing to stop the judges from their writings. Lasheminesh himself stated, "Those who wish to take advantage of outside ages and peoples cannot be stopped, must first be listened to within Dunny, not forced to take such extreme measures. When extreme measures are taken, the consequences must be increased." In 4305, law was passed stating that creation or trading of illicit ages was punishable by permanent imprisonment on solitary prison ages, a fate that some said was worse than death. In 4307, Lasheminesh passed barely another law stating that any Dunny who coerced an outsider to commit a crime, no matter what the crime, was also punishable by permanent imprisonment. While the laws were passed, Lasheminesh encouraged further interaction with the other cultures, while continuing to argue interaction itself was not the problem. However, it seems that as though many failed to see his stance and still pushed for stricter measures on the Guild of Writers and a complete sealing off of any interaction with outsiders. In 4334, the age of Tracers, a major mining age, was halfway destroyed because of the mistake of a native running Dunny machines that had been established there. Families were forced to evacuate, and, in one particularly odd case, supposedly a child was born while the mother had been linking from Traces back to Dunny. Regardless, the destruction of the age was another cause of argument for those who wished to seal themselves off in a case that Lasheminesh argued could have happened regardless of who was running the machine. Sadly, in 4438, Lasheminesh was assassinated by the same faction who had kidnapped his mother years earlier, making his life an example of what he had often preached. He was the Dunny who had to change. If they did not, he had argued, problems would always exist, whether or not outsiders were involved. He left the throne to the first son of his younger brother, as he had no children of his own, taken from a public speech explaining his signing of the law. Okay. One more to go before a gap. King G. This is mentioned in one of the previous ones. I'm not quite sure which one, though. Okay. G took the throne in 4438 at the very young age of 36. The combination of an apparently immature and weak king, along with the tension that was growing within Dunny over the outsiders and religious principles, went down in history as a bad one. At the start of his reign, government records say G was overtaken with his new palace life and the luxuries it afforded him. He seemed much more concerned with what kind of food he would be served for breakfast than whether or not Dunny should pull back all of its people who were living in outside ages, as some were suggesting, wrote another anonymous author. Because of his apparent lack of concern over the real issues, it was the grandmasters who quickly became the most frustrated with G. It was said by a few grandmasters in private journals that G would wholeheartedly agree with them while they presented their strategies and plans and agree with their challengers an hour later. The indecision by G made for little evidence of progress and complete frustration for most of Dunny. For the first time in many years, the signs of division began to appear as they had during the 2500s. The once unified religious beliefs showed signs of splitting. The once unified classes began to separate into rich and poor, and the once confident rulers of worlds began to wonder whether they could rule even themselves. Adding to the confusion were the words of the Watcher. The Watcher, as he had come to be known, and come to be called, was a child who had been born between ages and now, rumors said, had the ability to see beyond time, past, present, and future. In 4500, he wrote Words, a 625-line volume describing his visions of Dunny. Much of the book dealt with the great destruction of Dunny that would one day occur, and the signs that would come with that destruction. Many claimed that the book was seizing upon the chaos of the day and dismissed it as rubbish, while others seemed to be rather intrigued. Also in 4500, Guildmaster Kinef of the Guild of Legislators brought forth a proposal that would allow the use of private education, separate from the guilds, although many seemed frightened of the idea, as education and the guilds had always been thought of as inseparable. The proposals eventually passed by a slim margin. G apparently seemingly had little to say on the proposal one way or the other. G was married in 4502 to Melaine, a woman who had been married 3 previous times. It was G's first, and the prophetess advising him had strongly spoken against it. The marriage lasted 25 years before ending, and marked the first time any king had divorced one of his wives. G remarried in 4565 to a woman 100 years younger, something culturally accepted. It was the rumor that she was the daughter of the Watcher that created problems. She denied this claim, but did show quite a bit of interest in his writings and convinced G to do the same. The marriage lasted until 4645, 80 years later, when G's wife vanished. Some said outsiders had taken her. Since nothing has been resolved concerning them, others said G had had murdered her, and others said she had returned to be with her father, the Watcher, even though the Watcher died, and returned to her father, the Watcher, even though the Watcher died in 4606. G's final wife was one of his own prophetesses he had sought out for advice, marking another first for a king. The two were married until G's death in 4692. He left the throne to the third son of his close friend. He was 290 years old. To sum up G's reign, one author wrote, "There was a collective sigh of relief throughout the cavern on the day he finally left us." As spoken by Kenneth during debates to the council in 4500. It seems private education never really received near the admiration and respect from the public, and thus never truly succeeded. Coming among those still wanting to more strict guidelines pertaining to outside involvement. One of these gardeners claimed he witnessed the murder with his own eyes. Though the Watcher was believed to have died in 4606, there were numerous rumors of people claiming to have seen him and talked to him. Taken from a recently discovered manuscript that was apparently never published. Alright. Oh, there's a missing slot here. Let's see. Give me a second here. I don't want to lose my spot here. Okay. This is the 26th king who succeeded King Demath. King Yebelshan took the throne in 4843 at the age of 109. Though most commentaries say that he held to the same beliefs as his father, who, like I said, was Demath, it seems he was not nearly as strong and thus did not carry at the level of respect that his father had, a character trait that some of the more violent factions preyed upon. Demath had managed to refocus the Dunny to a large part. However, the few factions who still desired to make their case were able to make Yebelshan a very unpleasant one. In 4865, the blood of the Yavo kidnapped Yebelshan's first son from the Guild of Chemists. In a letter to the factions stated they would kill the king's son if one of their own leaders was not released. Yebelshan ordered the Reliama to find his son, but they were apparently unable to do so. Later it was discovered that a key member of the Reliama had joined the blood of Yavo and was aiding them. Feeling forced, Yebelshan gave into the demands and released the prisoner they had asked for. The body of his son appeared on the steps of the palace a few days later. The death of Yebelshan's son, along with newfound evidences of a mole within the Reliama, further separated Dunny into two sides. Those who wished to end outside intervention were becoming stronger, publicly raising their cause almost daily. Those who followed the majority were growing angrier and less tolerable of those who did not. As a result, there was little doubt that there were very few Dunny left who fell into the middle ground. There were even less, including Yebelshan, who could bridge the two sides. Yebelshan, in an apparent attempt to divert his people's attention from the brewing wars, decided in 4889 to announce remodels for all of the 18 major guilds. It was the first of its kind since the Dunny had been founded, and warmly embraced by the guilds. Under the announcement, Yebelshan changed some of the original restrictions of Renerif, offering the guilds more liberty in the structures they could build. In 4901, Yaboshan stated his plans for a new common library, located directly within the Yemen district of Duni, a middle-class district. In 4690, I'm sorry, I lost my spot here. Hang on. I apologize for this. I lost my spot. In 4910, he announced plans for a new park to be built on Nerif Island. In 4914, 3 new recreation ages were placed within the park as gifts from the Guild of Writers in order to celebrate the completion of their new guild. Did I say 4190 before instead of 4910? Okay. Middle-class district. The diversions seemed to do their job until 4954, when an explosion occurred on the age of Mianes, killing 400 outsiders and 78 Duni. It was apparently the result of a bad combination of gases. One the Duni had brought with them, and the other already in existence on Mianes. Another push was begun to steal themselves from outside influence. The Reliyama, who were usually counted on in these situations, apparently had no information as to the facts of the explosion. They were still apparently in the midst of their own chaos, trying to discover the mole. There were some who thought the explosion had been a setup, but it could not be proven. In 5043, Yaboshan placed a man by the name of Farish in charge of the Guild of Illusionists. His first mission, as ordered by Yaboshan himself, was to find whoever was destroying the Reliyama's ability to gain knowledge. The most believed that Farish had been more interested in actual illusions than the unseen. He was also known as an extremely intelligent man and immediately put into action a plan to clean up the Reliyama. He also began construction of a house on one of the private islands of the cavern that blatantly demonstrated his love for illusions. Yaboshan died in 5081 at the age of 347. He never had any other children after his son was killed, and left the throne to his youngest brother-in-law, his younger sister's husband. Goshen had been imprisoned in a prison book 50 years earlier by Demoth. From How They Came, a detailed look at what started the Medis War by Jamin, written in 7201. Mianes was well known for its production of mining machinery. From Revealing on the Unseen, written by Bisharin in 5999. Okay, King Emin. Emin took the throne in 5081 at the age of 150. 2 years after his coronation, 2 members of the Reliyama mysteriously disappeared and were never seen of again. Farish became a silent hero in the key members of the government, and the factions were again quieted, knowing they were being watched. Key members of the government were often seen at parties taking place in Farish's mansion, and rumors of puzzle rooms and secret halls grew throughout the city. The house itself, located on Cather Island, was becoming one of the more talked about buildings in the entire cavern. In 5093, 2 members of a cult known as One Duni were proven guilty for the explosion that had occurred years earlier on Mianes. Both were permanently imprisoned. At the same time, Emin, along with a guild of caterers, announced the completion of 2 new food ages, one of which was run solely by outsiders and produced new food sources that had never been tasted in Denny before. The popularity of Farish's mansion caused others, mainly elite, to request permission to build on the many islands that surrounded the city proper. In 1595, Emin decided to sell many of the islands that up to that point had been government property. Records indicate the sale of over 23 of the islands in 1 year to private citizens who could afford their heavy price tag. In 5102, disaster hit the family of Farish in the mysterious death of his daughter. Official city guard records said she awoke in the middle of the night, claiming to see spirits, and jumped from her bedroom window to her death. Rumors abounded as to the true cause. Some thought the house was haunted, while others, mainly government, thought she might have been a target of factions. Perhaps the most damaging rumors dealt with the Watcher. In words, he had described similar events taking place, and such a public event caused many to begin to study his words again. It was the beginning of philosophical chaos yet again. Farish left the house a year after the death of his daughter, claiming to be unable to live with the memories of his daughter. The house was given completely, although no one knew it at the time, to the Relima. Rumors of dark shadows in windows and boats silently rowing toward the island fueled the idea of the house was haunted. It appears that after the Relima controlled the house, Emin himself often made visits, recommending a number of renovations, tunnels, etc., that he thought would aid them in their cause. In 5202, a public ferry system was approved by Emin, offering much more frequent access between the island, the city proper, and the surrounding smaller islands. One of those islands, Emin gave to the minor guild of artists, musicians, and actors, who turned it into a cultural center. In later years, the center often hosted outside concerts, plays, etc., on the water. 4 years before Emin's death, the Guild of Stonemasons announced Derethenai. The substance had been produced in a laboratory for the first time and was the start of much improved construction techniques. Emin died of 5240 at the age of 309, leaving the throne to his firstborn son. This was not public information in around 6,000. However, the discovery of the moles, the discovery of the moles was well known in the highest circles of government, from haunted by her cries. Shema and Herias became known for a larger variety of fruits and vegetables that naturally grew on each. From Haunted by Her Cries, written by Hagen in 5120. Words has numerous Words had numerous references to dreams and mourning in the streets, which many interpreted to describe the death of Farish's daughter. Duethenai was a lightweight stone which proved to be extremely strong. Okay, this one here, which is not here, was actually King Mayamin. We read from earlier. So this one is King Adish. Okay. Adish took the throne in 5549 at the age of 49. Though Adish was young, it was also said that he was mature for his age, and took quite a bit of advice from the prophetess Tisari, who had also served his uncle, who I'm guessing was Mayaman. Adish was apparently a religious man, but not an especially accepting man. The prophet Gish arrived on the scene in 5574 and began preaching, similar to what Trevor had done years earlier. Unlike Trevor, Gish praised the words of Yahweh, but nothing else. The great king, he said, was a farce, and was Trevor. He denounced his people for claiming that Tegun was more important than following Yahweh's commands. He declared that Tavar and the great king had used Teguns as an excuse to do what they wanted, and when it was time to focus on Yahweh's commands again. One of these, he added, was no interaction with the outsiders, though Gish was not the first to say such things. For some reason, the public came in droves to listen to him, making him an extremely popular figure. Adish denounced Gish's words at every level and arrested him numerous times, and by such actions only encouraged Gish, arguably making his impact upon the society even larger than what it otherwise would have been. Gish continued in his preaching until, in an apparent fit of rage, Adish ordered the Relama to kill him. It was said later the decision was most likely the worst of his reign. The Relama succeeded in their mission in 5675. There was extreme outrage at the king as well as the official church. Exactly as Gish had taught, Adish had justified killing a man strictly against the laws of Yahweh, because he felt there was something more important that was justified because of Tegan. Gish became a martyr, and those who followed him increased. Adish made attempts to draw his people back, but it was too late. There were apparently very few people, even ardent followers of the great king, who could agree with his decision. In fact, it was rumored that it was one of Adish's close advisors who killed him in 5701 at the young age of 201. The throne was left to his firstborn son, Lenerin. The word literally means to love with the mind. All these asterisks are the exact same, they're not any different. I don't know which note goes to which one over here. Anyway, the word literally means to love with the mind, implying having a close personal knowledge of the other person, or in certain case Yahweh. It had been taught that in order to gain access into the perfect age, Yahweh only required such a relationship and nothing else. From Yahweh alone, written by Gish. Alright. Taken from the private journals of Tisari, many think it was in fact Tisari who convinced Adish to make the order. From the followers, written by Manish. Alright. Only 3 more to go, people. We're nearly there. King Lenerin. Alright. Before I begin, I'm going to drink some water here. Lanaran took the throne in 5701 at the age of 98. Lanaran had not been close to his father, and as a result was not much like him. It was rumored that it was because of him. It was rumored that it was because of Lanaran that Adish's own advisor had killed Adish. He knew Lanaran would give the people what they wanted. Lanaran immediately denounced the actions of his father in killing Gish and informed the public of the existence of the Relima, their involvement in the death of Gish, and promised to rid them from all government activities. The announcement was a shock to the public and a huge blow to those who had served the Relima. Most ended up living in hidden private ages, while a few were murdered after their years of service to the government. The loss of the Relima again gave the factions hope that they would be able to carry out their demonstrations again. However, Lanaran also promised to rid out the outsider involvement, meaning the factions had no need for such acts. It's believed that the promise was not one that Lanaran had necessarily meant to keep, but instead one he intended to pretend he was trying to meet to keep the factions happy. He also believed wholeheartedly in a plan to build a tunnel into the island and was able to push it through in 5714, as Mayamen had not been able to. While Stone Tooth was busy digging, Lanaran promised that its next task would be to continue expansion by the Ashemin district, with eventual plans to create new residential and cultural districts. Lanaran also ordered the major guilds to begin work on replacing all ages that required outsider involvement. He demanded ages that would carry out the same tasks but without outside involvement. Most guild masters knew the plan would take years and years, and though they did not agree with it, agreed to attempt it. In 5721, new techniques were developed to incorporate structural reinforcement and extrusion-based construction, some that would aid construction of the districts Lanaran had promised. In 5734, the tunnel connecting the island with the city proper was cancelled. Stone Tooth had been working on it for over 20 years, but the guildmasters, who were already required by Lanaran to replace the huge number of ages, were not about to connect their homes on the island with the city proper. Lanaran agreed, as there were further concerns that such construction could affect the lake level or even the algae within the lake. Instead, Stone Tooth was ordered to begin clearing out more space next to the Ashemin district. In 5856, construction was begun on the new Lanaran district. Stone Tooth was ordered to begin further exploration of the cavern by way of new tunnels. In 5902, the guilds announced 4 new ages to replace some of those being used by outsiders. The announcement meant little, except to have the factions believed that eventually outside involvement would be finished. 5903 marked the first inhabitants of the Lanaran district, mostly manual laborers who worked in the adjoining Ashemin. The Relima were officially finished with their work in 5986. The announcement was fairly quiet, as most of their work had ceased long before that. In 5999, Lanaran passed away at a very old age of 396. He left the throne to his 5th and youngest son. From Revealing the Unseen, written by Bisharin in 5999. From the private journals of Grandmaster Kaman, of the Guild of Legislators, from the Lost Tunnel, written by Leshem in 1634. The environmental damage claimed by Lanaran and Dunny environmentalists was never proven. Most agree it was an easy way out for Lanaran, who then did not have to admit he was bullied by the Grandmasters who lived on the island. Three of the ages were food ages, while the fourth was meant to replace one of the major manufacturing ages. In reality, none of them were ever used to the extent the ages they were replacing had been used. Alright, that's it for that book. Ooh, 2 more to go, people. Almost there. That book we just skipped over was I believe the 31st king, who was King Asemleth. And this one is King Jaren. Jaren took the throne in 6284 at the age of 83. He was apparently much like his father, more interested in keeping everyone happy than declaring one side of the debates concerning philosophy, advancement, or outside involvement, right or wrong. As a result, though the people were satisfied, there was further division among them. There was further division among them. The elite and poor became more divided, and though there was quite a bit of new construction and renovation in both the elite and poor districts, there was nothing done to join the two. For some reason, Jaren was obsessed with expansion and exploration of the cavern. There were rumors his obsession stemmed from Watcher prophecies, and one in particular stated, because of tunnels, Dunny has changed forever. Jaren never said what drove him, but throughout his reign, he pushed the Guild of Miners, mechanists, engineers, and surveyors to work together to create new drills and machinery. He had great plans to widen the Rudena Passage, which when opened would allow for further expansion. In 6430, the announcement came. Rugbiter and the Burrower were both christened in a great ceremony and then immediately put to work. Stone Tooth and Stone Eater were used for further city expansion. The once violent factions that had existed were, for the most part, dissolving. Many of their members were seemingly beginning to call themselves followers of Yavo, as Gish had been, and though they did not support outside involvement, they believed it was best to obey Yavo and hope for a peaceful solution. Though Jaren carried out a few meetings with the factions, the dissolution of the factions had little to do with his policies or leadership. Regardless, he was able to focus on mining efforts without consequences. It was a luxury the previous kings had not been afforded, and the main reason some of the greatest expansion in Dunny history began under Jaren. Jaren himself died in 6498 at the age of 297. Though he did see the completion of the expansion of the Rudena Passage, he never saw the new areas to which the passage led. He left the throne to his third son. Alright, my friend, we're on the last book here. Let's get started. King Rakuth. Okay. It's fairly short. Hang on. Water break first. Rakuth took the throne in 6498 at the age of 56. Though young, he had 2 older brothers and a sister with whom, it was said, he often consulted. They each understood the logic of giving the throne to the youngest son. It guaranteed more time in the throne for the individual, and worked well with their younger brother, as no other family had done previously. Rakuth's first major decision came in 65 10, when a new cavern was found by expeditions led by Lockbiter and the Burrower. There were calls to expand the city, but Rakuth was apparently unconvinced it was a smart plan. His older brother, who happened to be guildmaster of the Guild of Surveyors, agreed to study the cavern extensively, and Rakuth promised to make a decision upon reading results of the study. In the meantime, Rakuth married in 6556 to a woman named Hisha. Her father was Grand Master of the Guild of Chemists and a strong believer in Gesh and the fallacy of the Great King. Though Hisha had some influence on Rakuth, he continued in the tradition of his fathers, never publicly stating his views on philosophy. However, she had much more influence on the three sons that they would eventually have together, including the youngest Kirath. It was her who influence that would change Dunny forever. In 6601, extremely detailed reports, structural analysis, water supply, rock type, etc., came back informing Rakuth that though the newly discovered cavern was habitable, it would be very expensive to build in. Rakuth made the decision, after conferring with his advisors, that Stone Tooth, along with the new rock biter, should begin digging out more of the city proper into the cave wall for expansion, while Burrower and Stone Eater would continue to tunnel past the cavern. In 6676, Rakuth met with leaders to discuss the involvement of outsiders. Though there had been no major incidents for hundreds of years, it was still an issue to be discussed. In the meetings, it became apparent that though Rakuth understood the reasons for wishing to close down interaction with outsiders, it was a ridiculous thought. Their contribution to Dunny, culture, art, construction, technology, and resources was immeasurable. Unless there were grand reasons not to, there was no way, he argued, that he would ever force strict resolutions regarding the outsiders. In his older years, it appeared as though Rakuth became tired of Hisha and her views and opinions. That would be his wife. And opinions. She was expelled from the palace along with Kirath in 6700. It was well known that Kirath was a model of his mother's thoughts, and Rakuth could hardly stand him. Though Rakuth had chosen an older brother of Kirath to be king, his thoughts were changed. As the legends told, Rakuth was on his own deathbed, staring out toward the arch, and he saw his son, Kirath, sailing through it. He was riding a boat in the shape of a massive lizard, standing proudly on its prow, and had come home to announce the death of his mother. As he sailed through the arch, Rakuth apparently felt the hand of Yavo, directing him to make Kirath the next king of Dunny. By the end of Rakuth's reign, the city was larger than ever. The classes were more divided than ever, and their religious beliefs were as divided as ever. Though there were not a large variety of beliefs, there was no clear majority of people who believed any one thing. Rakuth passed away in 6731 at the age of 289, leaving the throne to his third son, Kirath. He left him a city that was larger than it had ever been, and fairly evenly divided in its views of the future. Years later, it would be a forceful argument for council ruling. From The Last King, written by Yemes in 7002, from How They Came, a detailed look at what started the Medis War by Jamin, written in 7201. From The Last King, written by Yemas 7002. Okay. Alright, that, my friends, is it. Every single book in this library has been read, and wow, there is a major undertaking. I'll be having to do a lot of editing before it can be viewed publicly. But if you're watching this, and if you watched the whole thing, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I know it was a lot to cover. And next time, the next video, as I said in the beginning, has already been recorded. So the next video you'll see will be the conclusion of this expansion pack to Dunny. And after that, I will begin the next expansion pack called Path of the Shell. So, until next time everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button. And I will see you all next time. So till then, take care and have a great rest of your day.